This panel is the Adversaries, Partners, Allies in the UK in the third nuclear age. My name's Kearney. I work for Rolls-Royce in our government relations team. And I have a fantastic panel here alongside me. So we have Ciara Rushton. She's very recently graduated from undertaking an MA in Intelligence and International Security at King's College. She's also a fellow at the International Atomic Energy Association, IAEA, and has worked as a research associate for RUSI as well. She specialises on nuclear signalling and the role of nuclear weapons in the foreign policy of authoritarian states. Major Callum Gaskell, he's here and he joined the Royal Marines in 2016. Apologies, not quite as recently, and has served on global deployments as a troop commander, fire support group commander, and company second in command. If he wasn't busy enough, he's also studying currently for a PhD at Keele University on how the use of space domain in the Ukraine conflict will affect global nuclear deterrence. And Schiff is a programme coordinator and research associate with the Project of Nuclear Issues at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. She has previously worked as a political intern at Department of State Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in their legislative and a legislative intern in the Senate with a foreign policy background. The talk today, all the panelists here have focused on the deterrence with our key adversaries in the nuclear space, particularly Russia, and what we can learn from the conflict in Ukraine and the changing nature of deterrence in modern conflict. I am going to hand over to Ciara for her presentation.
Thank you to the organisers and to all of the panellists for a fantastic day of discussion so far. My name is Ciara, and as you've heard, I've just finished my Masters in Intelligence and International Security at King's College London. My presentation today is adapted from my Master's dissertation on the development of Russian nuclear signalling and posturing from 2000 to August 2025 and the rationale behind this. My research is qualitative in nature, based on original Russian language government documents, supplemented by databases such as those by the Project on Nuclear Issues and the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. I also consult Russian and Western media reports and other sources, including Telegram posts. In using these sources and providing this long-term perspective and analysis, I hope to uncover what underlies Russian nuclear decision-making based on past examples and trends. My presentation is structured as follows. First, I will consider past examples of Russian nuclear signalling from 2000 to 2022, looking specifically at how these tactics were employed in conflict scenarios in Ukraine and Georgia in order to gain a long-term view as to how Russian nuclear decision-making has developed. From here, I will go on to assess how this past has evolved into the explicit nuclear signalling that we see from Russia today in the war in Ukraine, which displays much learning on its part from the previous post-Cold War conflict scenarios. I find that Russian nuclear decision-making has long been based on a rational appreciation of the benefits of different approaches and a careful consideration of how to send nuclear signals, demonstrating that the current explicit or madman approach is symptomatic of this rationality and not a diversion from it. Finally, I will conclude by considering the implications of my research for the UK's deterrence against Russia and how we can prevent it and other adversaries from gaining advantages through the use of nuclear threats in the future. Throughout my research, I've assessed Russian nuclear signalling and posturing through indicators of rhetoric and readiness, which I believe comprise the main ways in which states convey nuclear signals. Indicators of rhetoric include greater allusions to capabilities in statements, greater aggression in statements when directed at adversaries, and doctrinal changes, such as the raising or the lowering of the nuclear threshold. Indicators of readiness include the enhancement of capabilities and their role in Russian military planning, a greater output of statements on specific capabilities, and a greater volume of military exercises over a certain period, especially those involving nuclear weapons or nuclear-capable systems. Russia's relationship with nuclear weapons from 2000 to 2012 was tumultuous. At some points, so-called denuclearization was seen as the most likely outcome due to enduring financial constraints after the fall of the Soviet Union. In practice, this saw the strategic rocket force downgraded from being on par with the Army, Navy, and Air Force to merely a service, and this was reflected in doctrine, with the 2000 foreign policy concept committing Russia to further reduction of its nuclear potential. However, modernization of Russia's arsenal continued and a steady pattern of military exercises took place, including an October 2002 exercise that simulated Russia's ability to conduct a large-scale nuclear strike and the Zapad 2009 exercises, which are thought to have simulated a nuclear strike on Poland, notably a NATO country. This is especially salient given what we've seen in recent days and weeks from Russia in the Zapad 2025 exercises. The 5-day war in Georgia in 2008 reflected this Russian tendency to retain a strong nuclear backstop, even if other means of conducting warfare were to be prioritized. Whilst Frank Miller of the US Air Force has argued that Russia raised its nuclear alert levels to prevent, quote, NATO adventurism during the conflict, overt nuclear threats in the manner seen since 2022 in Ukraine were not made. One important feature of the Georgia war for Russian nuclear posturing and signaling, however, was the so-called green light effect. This refers to the weak response of the West to this war, with the new US administration under Barack Obama seeking a reset in relations with Russia merely months after the Georgia conflict. Whilst the war in Georgia might have only seen nuclear weapons play a background role then, the weak global response might have both emboldened Russia to pursue greater geopolitical interests in Ukraine and to utilize more aggressive means, namely nuclear threats, in doing so. During this period, then, rhetoric indicators were low as there was simply no need for explicit nuclear threats to be made, but readiness was moderate in order to retain a strong nuclear backstop. The case of Russian nuclear signaling from 2013 to 2022 is in some ways reflective of that in Georgia, but also differed due to this green light effect and other geopolitical circumstances. Namely, there was the perceived threat of United States anti-ballistic missile systems in Europe, which pervaded a lot of Russian statements at this time, and therefore meant that there was already a heightened level of geopolitical unrest. Therefore, when it came to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the picture was different than in Georgia. The same factors of the ease of the invasion, with Russia utilizing its base at Sevastopol to quickly move troops into the peninsula, played a role in reducing the overall nuclear tone of Russia's invasion. However, as international backlash increased, including with Russia's exclusion from the Group of Eight, so did nuclear rhetoric, with Putin stating that other states should not mess with Russia because of its nuclear strength. During the early period of Russia's ongoing conflict with Ukraine, readiness remained moderate and rhetoric remained low, but gradually increased with more significant spikes, especially when in response to worsening geopolitical circumstances. This again highlights that Russia pays clear attention to the development of the external scenario during its conflict and adapts its nuclear signals as necessary. Finally, in our study, we can turn to consider Russia's nuclear signaling and posturing in Ukraine from 2022 to present, where its nuclear threats have played a significant role throughout the conflict. The war began with Putin issuing a nuclear threat to outside actors in his address on 24 February 2022, and threats have continued throughout, including a recent high-profile threat by Dmitry Medvedev, warning President Trump to remember the, quote, fabled dead hand, referring to a secretive semi-automated Russian system set to launch missiles upon a decapitation strike on its leadership. Russia also notably lowered its nuclear threshold within its doctrine in November 2024, allowing nuclear strikes when threats are critical to the state rather than threatening the state's very existence, as in previous iterations of nuclear doctrine after 2010. On readiness, Russia has taken steps to clearly signal its bolstered nuclear posture through the launching of a dual-capable Oreshnik intercontinental ballistic missile on Dnipro in Ukraine in November 2024, and the moving of tactical nuclear missiles to Belarus from 2023. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, then, Russia's rhetoric and readiness signals have consistently been at a high level. The intensity of these signals has differed depending on different situations throughout the war. The risk of nuclear war was estimated to have been at its highest in October 2022, around the period when Russia annexed 4 Ukrainian provinces and began to peddle the conspiracy that Ukraine was planning to use a dirty bomb in the conflict. Signals also intensified when external actors, especially the West, increased their involvement, as in September and November 2024, when President Biden permitted the use of Western long-range missiles inside Russian territory, potentially leading to the strike on Dnipro and the updated doctrine. This shows again that signals have been carefully adapted to respond to Russia's perceived needs and external threats as the conflict goes on. However, the fact that Russia faced such strong backlash from its annexation of the Crimea explains why threats have been so prominent since the very beginning of the war, as the geopolitical situation was already poor for Russia and it had little desire to better it due to its increasing polarization from the West. These cases are fruitful for understanding how Russia uses its nuclear arsenal to signal to other states and to gain bargaining advantages. They suggest that, during the Putin era, Russia has adopted a rational approach to its nuclear signaling, based on a careful appreciation of internal and external factors that influence effectiveness. This explains what has been referred to as its flirtation with the madman theory of nuclear signalling since at least 2022, wherein Russia has engaged in explicit nuclear brinkmanship in an effort to prevent further Western support for Ukraine. This, I argue, has been more successful than is often attributed. At the very least, it has deterred the West from direct involvement in the conflict through, for example, putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. The escalation risks brought on through Russia's nuclear signalling will likely also force Ukraine into a position of neutrality into the future, preventing it from the guarantees it seeks through NATO membership. Finally, even though aid to Ukraine in military, economic and political forms has been extensive from the West, these perceived risks through Russia's nuclear signals have also been important in delaying developments, such as the permitting of long-range missiles to be used on Russian territory. Russian leaders have subsequently perceived its nuclear threat and its arsenal as a whole as an effective asset throughout this war, with Dmitry Medvedev arguing in 2022 that Russia would have been, quote, torn apart were it not for its nuclear strength. Looking forward, we might be able to expect a similar green light effect as that seen after the war in Georgia, with Russia continuing to perceive nuclear brinkmanship as an effective means for pursuing its geopolitical interests. This will especially be the case if Russia gains a favourable ceasefire, particularly including territorial concessions on the part of Ukraine. So what can the UK do with this knowledge? First and foremost, it must continue to call Russia's bluff. Whilst not ignoring these signals or downplaying them, we should remain aware that many of Russia's red lines have been crossed without the promised retaliation, and thus we should not be scared out of supporting Ukraine. Secondly, we should promote further arms control regarding nuclear weapons amongst allies, including through the renewal of existing means such as New START. Arms control has been an effective means for reducing Russia's ability to rely on its nuclear strength in the past and will lessen escalation risks as we enter a new era of geopolitics. The UK should also help promote a favourable ceasefire, not including territorial concessions, in order to prevent the aforementioned green light effect from re-emerging. Linked to this, future adversaries such as China should be monitored, especially once we have a fuller picture of the war in Ukraine after its conclusion, and communicated with to ensure that nuclear brinkmanship is not again seen as an effective means of achieving one's geopolitical aims. Finally, and especially if the previous options fail, we should seek to improve our own deterrent and respond with might to the threat posed by Russia and other adversaries, including through potentially exploring closer relations with the US and France in this regard. Whilst just a few options from many, these symbolise how the UK can act upon this knowledge to prevent such tactics being used in the future. To conclude, I've argued that the arc of post-Cold War Russian nuclear signalling has seen a gradual rise in the explicitness of Russia's posture due to a rational appreciation on the part of the Russian leadership of external threat scenarios and how nuclear weapons can be best conducive to achieving its goals. Subsequently, the overt nuclear threats seen since 2022 from Russia are not a departure from rational thinking on nuclear signalling, but symbolic of it. If Russia achieves a favourable ceasefire in Ukraine and the West backs down, we are likely to see it continue on this path in future conflicts, and Russia's example might pave the way for other adversaries. Thank you very much for listening, and whilst it's been a short overview, I'm very happy to expand on any of the points I've mentioned so far in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Callum, and I'm a PhD student at Keele University, and it is the subject of my PhD research that forms the basis of what I'm going to speak about today. The research itself is concerned with the relationship between the space domain and the system of global nuclear deterrence, using the Ukraine conflict as a case study to kind of elucidate elements of that relationship. And Astro-Deterrence is a term that is the title of my research, and it's a term I've kind of come up with to try and encapsulate all that. But what I plan to do today is spend the first few minutes talking through some broad context on the space security landscape before introducing what I believe are the three key implications of the Ukraine conflict for space security, and then crucially what that might mean for the system of global nuclear deterrence. So jumping straight into that, I'm using JDP 040, which is the UK military doctrine on space power, because this document uses 4 C's to characterise the space domain, which I'll talk through now. The first is congested, and this principally refers to the decreased cost of access to the space domain and how that's facilitated a wider breadth of actors, both nation-state and non-state actors, such as commercial space entities, to populate Earth orbit with their satellites. However, it's not just the fact that we have more actors than ever before using space, but it's the way that they're using it. Particularly the prevalence of satellite constellations in low Earth orbit mean that not only do we have a situation where space is becoming more congested, but it's actually becoming more congested more quickly. And to put things into perspective, in 1962 there were 24 satellites in Earth orbit operated by 2 nation states, no prizes for guessing who they were. And as of 2025, we have over 50,000 satellites in Earth orbit operated by controllers in over 190 different countries. So that's how far we've come so quickly. The next C is complex, and this principally refers to the role of multi-use technology. So what I mean by that is that there are many satellites in Earth orbit that have completely benign civilian applications, but also harbour capabilities that are very useful to support military operations and the use of force. And the ambiguity of what any given satellite can do or what purpose it's currently serving throws up some real complications for things like the space domain regulation, as well as decision making at times of high tension and crisis. Then we have critical, and I don't think I need to labour the point on this one too much. We can all appreciate how vital space assets are for military operations in all domains in the modern age, as well as our critical national infrastructure, our economy, and really how space assets permeate all aspects of our everyday lives in often ways we take for granted. But I'll leave it for the Strategic Defence Review to summarise when it said that assured access to space now supports approximately 20% of UK GDP, and the loss of GPS alone would incur a cost of around £1 billion a day to the UK economy. And then finally, we have contested, and again, it won't be lost on you in this forum that there is a sentiment that we are living in a pre-war era, and we're witnessing the erosion of a rules-based liberal world order in favour of a new era of global politics characterised by increased strategic competition. And why this is important in space, I think, is due to the current inadequacy of the global space governance regime. So, for example, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 has come to serve a quasi-constitutional role in space legal frameworks, yet this treaty is itself becoming rapidly obsolete in the face of modern space technological capabilities. And also the terms used in it are inherently vague. For example, peaceful purposes have been manipulated and twisted in line with state national interest, almost to the point where they have lost value. So with that rapid but hopefully holistic understanding baseline of space security in place, I'll now introduce the Ukraine conflict. And the first implication I'll draw your attention to is the deterioration of political relations between Russia and what we can collectively term as the West. And on this, the Ukraine conflict has been a major contributor to this new atmosphere in global politics of increased competition, multipolarity and instability in the international security landscape. And evidence of the political fallout of the conflict can be recognised as being projected vertically into the space domain and manifesting itself in space politics. For example, the eRosita X-ray telescope, which is a joint German-Russian venture, as well as the ExoMars rover mission, a joint project between the European Space Agency and Roscosmos. Both of these projects were cancelled in the wake of the full-scale invasion. And it was the European half of the joint projects that terminated them, explicitly highlighting Russia's aggression in Ukraine as their reason for doing so. And I think this is expressive of a breakdown in political relations having real effects in space affairs. And thinking back to the previous slide where I touched upon the contested nature of the contemporary space security, I think the salient point here is that the key political ramification of the conflict is that it sees us moving in a political direction that takes us away from increased cooperation, regulation, and ultimately mending the ills of the current space legal framework, and actually pushes us towards even more competition, even more contestation, and potentially a space arms race contained within a broader security dilemma. Then we have the demonstration of space capabilities as a result of the conflict, and the role of technological innovation has been a key theme for observers and analysts of the conflict. And this is exemplified, of course, by the advances in drone warfare, both on land and in the Black Sea. But this climate of combat Darwinianism that it's fostered is also applicable to space assets, which have also played a key role in the conflict, mostly through satellite imagery, providing situational awareness to Ukrainian commanders, as well as a means for countering Russian disinformation about the war, but also satellite communications, providing a diversity and redundancy in command and control structures for the Ukrainian military operations. In parallel to this, space assets always have and continue to play a huge role in existing nuclear deterrence architectures. And this is evident across the full gamut of enabling activities for nuclear deterrence, including targeting, missile guidance, missile defense, and command and control of nuclear forces. And because of this, I think the lessons derived from the Ukraine conflict on how best to employ modern space capabilities, particularly those of rapidly evolving technologies such as synthetic aperture radar and hyperspectral imagery satellites, lessons on how to best employ them will likely be applied to these existing nuclear deterrence strategies. And we can see burgeoning evidence of this already with Trump's Golden Dome initiative, as well as the vast Russian investment in anti-satellite weapons, and even things like in March earlier this year, numerous Chinese satellites were observed conducting what were described as intense maneuvers, and analysts believe that to be them simulating a kind of dogfighting scenario of satellites in Earth orbit. And then finally, we have the refocus of political attention on nuclear weapons. And, it's pretty much impossible to disentangle the Ukraine war with nuclear weapons and, by extension, nuclear deterrence. Whether it's the Russian nuclear saber rattling, which Ciara so eloquently went through just before me, or the reciprocal Western posture changes, kind of symbolized most prominently by Emmanuel Macron's Euro-nuke rhetoric. Or probably most importantly is Ukraine's own disarmament in the 1990s. And I would go so far to say that the Ukrainian decision to relinquish its inherited stockpile of Soviet nuclear weapons in 1994 has not only slowed but potentially halted or even reversed any progression towards global nuclear disarmament symbolized by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2021. And given that Ukraine is now fighting a war of national survival, the strategic lesson appears clear. If you have nuclear weapons, keep them. And this is supported helpfully or unhelpfully, depending on your perspective, by flanking affairs in world politics, such as the India-Pakistan standoff earlier this year, as well as the uranium enrichment efforts of Iran and the Israeli and American joint action to suppress them. But the underlying key point here for this bottom one is that the Ukraine conflict, I think, has reinforced the role of nuclear weapons as the centerpiece of national defense strategies and the ultimate guarantor of national security. So what does all this mean? Well, I think we have a perfect storm of circumstances whereby Ukraine has impacted the international political environment that makes increased cooperation in space less likely and increased competition in space more likely. Simultaneous to this, it has served to advertise the utility and potency of modern space capabilities, which is likely to have a catalytic effect on their further development and integration into existing nuclear deterrence strategies. And then concurrent to both of these dynamics, we have the conflict fortifying the role of nuclear weapons to occupy a position of unrivaled primacy in national and international security strategies. And to draw things to a close then, I think that these three implications that I've spoken through combine like three strands in a rope to throw up some really profound questions for the future of nuclear deterrence, such as, will we see nuclear weapons positioned in Earth orbit, and has Russia made serious advances to achieving this already? Question mark. How will we best manage the rapid introduction of multi-use technologies into existing conventional and nuclear deterrent structures? And what will be the role of the ever more influential non-state actors in space? And as you can see on the side of the slide there, these are issues that academia, industry and governments are all grappling with. However, to construct realistic answers to these questions, I think ultimately much will depend on the manner in which the Ukraine conflict finally comes to an end. That about covers everything I wanted to say in the 12 minutes, but very much look forward to any questions you might have in the Q&A.
Sorry, I want to make sure that worked. Okay. Hi, my name is Bailey Schiff, and I'm a program coordinator and research assistant at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'm here today to talk to you about navigating nuclear divides in a more autonomous Europe. And this is going to be drawing off of my undergraduate thesis that I did at American University, focusing on U.S. Allied credibility, confidence in U.S. extended deterrence during the Cold War. So I'll just jump right into it. So we see these press headlines daily. Poland wants expanded nuclear access, Germany urges coordination with the United Kingdom and France, and Macron debates the future of French nuclear protection. With growing uncertainty over the US's commitment to NATO, Europe is grappling with whether it can credibly support or even substitute American extended nuclear deterrence. And while the debate has focused on nuclear sufficiency and the political feasibility of a joint UK-French deterrent, another question looms that I want to focus on here today. And that's, would it be seen as credible by allies who disagree on nuclear doctrine, posture, and defense priorities? To answer this question, this presentation draws on my undergraduate thesis, which examined how nuclear policy disagreements shaped Allied confidence in U.S. assurances during major NATO credibility crises. And across 3 case studies, it found that misaligning nuclear policy was a reoccurring fault line in NATO's history, triggering credibility crises despite previously strong force posture, interoperability, and confidence. So in a more autonomous Europe, these findings could suggest that credible deterrence will hinge not just on arsenal structure, but also on whether allies can bridge larger gaps in nuclear policy. And without that consensus, Europe could face the same credibility challenges that the US has long struggled to contain, underscoring the need for the United Kingdom to take a proactive role in fostering alliance cohesion today. So to make this case, this presentation will begin by first revisiting thesis research while homing in on the Euromissile crisis as a critical case. Next, it will apply American lessons from the crisis to emerging nuclear gaps in Europe today. And finally, it will offer some potential policy avenues for the United Kingdom. So the thesis examined 3 alliance crises: France's withdrawal from NATO's integrated command, the Euromissile crisis, and Germany's Atomwaffen debate, focusing on France in the first 2 and Germany in the third. It used archival research and process tracing to test whether nuclear policy misalignment, measured across 4 different indicators, posture, doctrine, crisis stability, and arms control, was a necessary or sufficient cause of reduced confidence in U.S. assurances. And it then tested this theory against alternative explanations within each case. And these included Gaullist strategic autonomy, Soviet misinformation, and Trump-era rhetoric. France served as a historically skeptical ally, with reoccurring doctrinal divergence, while Germany acted as more of a shadow case to test the theory contemporarily with a more closely aligned and integrated ally. The research found that nuclear misalignment was a necessary condition and a consistent driver of NATO credibility crises, even among allies with historically high confidence, alignment, and integration. This presentation will take a closer look at the Euromissile crisis, but I'd be happy to discuss the other cases during the Q&A session. So the Euromissile crisis was a confrontation between NATO and the Soviet Union in the late 1970s over intermediate-range missile deployments. The case study found that French skepticism of U.S. assurances cannot just be attributed to Gaullist strategic autonomy, but rather were triggered by specific disagreements across 3 distinct phases that I'll touch on here today, and those related to Pershing II deployments, President Carter's flexible response strategies, and the Strategic Defense Initiative. So in the first phase, NATO's dual-track decision to pursue arms control while also deploying missiles in parallel did increase alliance cohesion on paper, but for France, it actually deepened some divisions with Washington that were pre-existing. The thesis archival research found that in declassified State Department memos, Presidents d'Estaing and Mitterrand both privately voiced concerns about European risk, decoupling, and U.S. reliability. And in parliamentary debates, ministers used the deployments to advocate for missile and submarine upgrades or even a Euro-deterrent to fill holes in the American umbrella. In the second phase, revisions to U.S. targeting strategies, the neutron bomb leaks, and the graduated response doctrines amplified tensions with France, who collectively saw these steps as lowering the nuclear threshold. For example, the archival research found in a speech, Prime Minister Meroy warned that U.S. counterforce strategies risk turning Europe into a rung on the ladder of violence, fueling calls for European autonomy, while other officials tried to bolster defense cooperation with the Western European Union. And in the final phase, American attempts to promote the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, in NATO discussions triggered more of a diplomatic rupture. In contrast to other allies, France saw SDI not as a separate episode, but rather an intensification of ongoing nuclear policy tensions. In a UN speech, Mitterrand warned it undermined mutual vulnerability and risked space-based arms races. And when France eventually blocked the initiative within NATO, the US was forced to rewrite the program to reassure allies. So this case, alongside findings from the French withdrawal and the German nuclear debates, provide us with 3 lessons learned I'm going to touch on briefly. And the first is that persistent misalignment should be seen as a liability that quietly weakens assurances, even if there's not a major diplomatic rupture. In the Euromissile crisis, it wasn't just Gaullist autonomy, but rather repeated clashes over deployment, targeting, and later the Strategic Defense Initiative that worsened French doubts. And secondly, once activated, skepticism tends to deepen, driving elite debate, structural distancing, or even exploration of alternative assurances. For France, this meant leaning on the Western European Union and debating a Euro-deterrent. And lastly, repairing alignment after major breaks is costly, and it requires far more political effort than responding to divisions as they emerge. To win back Allied credibility after SDI, Washington had to invest in expensive joint research initiatives and overhaul its existing policy. And these 3 lessons should frame how we think about Europe today. So going back to that original thought experiment I posed at the beginning, we can see some potential fault lines over deterrence that could reemerge in a future European framework, and these would surround nuclear thresholds, disarmament pressures, and the centrality of nuclear weapons within NATO. So should a UK-French deterrent become a necessity, this prompts the question of whether it could sustain Allied confidence without the political, institutional, and operational buffers that have historically preserved cohesion. So I'll just briefly talk through these 3 potential gaps. So the first relates to nuclear thresholds. The UK-French emphasis on strategic ambiguity and proportional response could differ from Poland and the Baltic states' preference for forward defense and lower nuclear thresholds. In the future, this could leave frontline allies doubting whether a UK-French deterrent would escalate to nuclear use on their behalf. And secondly, domestic disarmament pressures. The public support for the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy, is forcing governments to square away NATO's nuclear role with anti-nuclear public opinions and parliamentary pressures. Although I acknowledge this hasn't yet impacted participation, mass activism during the Euromissile crisis and recent German debates in 2020 could show the risk. And in a more autonomous Europe, these pressures risk further politically constraining government support for nuclear-sharing allies. And finally, beyond the TPNW, allies also differ on the centrality of nuclear weapons to national defense. For the UK, France, and the Baltic states, traditional nuclear deterrence is essential. But other allies, like Denmark and Spain, downplay the importance of nuclear threats in national strategies, instead prioritizing conventional and missile defense. In a future potential framework, these differences could weaken nuclear and conventional integration or complicate potential burden sharing. So together, these gaps could risk undermining Allied confidence, and as well as cohesion in a future framework. So for the United Kingdom, there are 3 practical avenues to address this problem, should the need emerge, but also to just improve cohesion today. So there's 3 different policy suggestions I want to focus on, and they relate to anchoring dialogue within NATO, deepening bilateral cooperation with France, and raising nuclear literacy across the alliance. So first, London should press for Paris to participate in the NPG as an observer. This would be largely political, but it would integrate French perspectives into alliance nuclear planning without creating duplicative consultation frameworks. And secondly, the United Kingdom should build on the Northwood Declaration to formalize regular high-level consultations with Paris, especially centering around escalation logic, deterrence doctrines, and crisis stability. and these discussions would be crucial for developing a baseline for Europe as a whole. And finally, London should launch a European nuclear deterrence literacy initiative to build expertise among NATO's non-nuclear allies. This could include funding for joint research programs related to nuclear thresholds and conventional nuclear integration, and potentially even produce papers ahead of NATO summits to help align allies. Although these steps cannot on their own fully bridge nuclear gaps, they can start to develop a European framework and signal a proactive commitment to the continent's defense while complementing existing U.S. commitments. Thank you so much for you all for listening, and to Receive for having me.